Hi everyone, this is Nicole McInnes. I'm an instructor here at Lindenwood, and I understand you all are doing a unit a week on publishing as part of your course. I do teach the publishing course here at Lindenwood, and I'm always open if anyone has any questions about what we talk about today or any questions about that course. So you can always email me nmcinnes@lindenwood.edu. That is NMCINNES at lindenwood.edu. So you all sent some fabulous questions. And one of the things I love about teaching the publishing course is that my students tend to ask so many great questions throughout the quarter that I learn a ton. And I've had quite a few experiences in the publishing world as an author, but I always learn a lot. And I thought these were great questions as well. I did need to whittle down the list to about 8 questions just in the interest of time. So let's dive right into those. The first one, what advice can you give someone on trying to find work in publishing? So the sort of common wisdom on this up to this time in history, and who knows where we're going from here after the pandemic and the lockdown, and how this is going to change the landscape of publishing, which has always been such a traditional in-person sort of face-to-face business in many ways. The traditional wisdom has always been move to New York City. It may still be that way once this is all said and done. We don't really know. Obviously, things have been virtual. We've had virtual capabilities for so long, but still, to my knowledge, talking with agents and editors and publishers, that side of the business tends to be a very in-person, go out to lunch, get drinks, go out to dinners, do face-to-face meetings. That has traditionally been what it is. That said, do you have to live in New York City to have a job in publishing? Absolutely not. What I do recommend is check out the major industry publications. The 3 that come to mind are Publishers Weekly, Publishers Lunch, and Publishers Marketplace. You'll see a lot of job listings. I think all 3 are subscription, and the prices can vary, but I do think there is at least some free content with those as well. So those are the 3 I would check out, in addition to any other publishing journals or websites or people who are on Twitter. Agents and editors are often very forthcoming with information, and check out agencies specifically. They will sometimes post job availabilities, job descriptions, depending on what you want to do. If you want to be an editor, you're probably going to look more at a publishing house. If you want to be, say, an agent's assistant to start out, go through the slush pile kind of thing, then you look at agencies. Just be willing to do your legwork is what I would say. Another question, is there a preference in publishing for dealing directly with authors or dealing with agents? This is a great question. It's a fairly common question, and I wondered the same thing back in the day before I had my agent. I don't know that I'd say there's a preference, but there are numbers, there are percentages. Yes, there are editors out there who will accept what are called unagented submissions. So that's basically you have a manuscript or a chapbook or whatever it is you write. You find those editors who don't require an agent to act as a sort of go-between. So are they out there? Yes. Do I think your odds are probably a little tougher not having an agent? Your odds of connecting with an editor and having a manuscript accepted and ultimately selling that manuscript? I do. So while it is possible to be published without an agent, in my experience, there are so many reasons to have an agent beyond just the sale. The sale is just the beginning. Once a manuscript sells, you have contract negotiations, you have a lot of industry stuff that needs to happen in order for a book to find its way into the hands of readers. So personally, I would never want to do that journey. Even though I've been through it twice now, I still wouldn't want to do it unagented. So something to think about. But so as far as is there a preference, my thought is yes. I think most editors at large, say the big 5 publishing houses, really prefer, maybe even require, I would need to go through, or you would need to go through and look at what they're saying publicly, but probably do prefer working with agents. Agents and editors in New York City know each other. They have lunches together. Well, they did pre-pandemic. And I'm guessing they will again. Very social, very sort of close-knit small community, as huge as it can seem. So, you know, they're used to working together. Agents, of course, provide a wonderful filter for editors. So I think the odds are, if you're serious about traditional publication, personally, I would recommend really putting energy into finding an agent who's a good fit. That's something, incidentally, that we cover at length in the publishing course. That whole process of agenting, and should you even have an agent, depending on what you're writing. Another question: should your novel be 100% finished before querying an agent? This is a super simple answer. Capital letters: yes, 100%. That manuscript, in whatever category and or genre you're writing, should be polished to within an inch of its life. This is sometimes discouraging for writers to hear. They think, well, it's pretty good. I wrote it. It's a pretty solid draft. I'll just send it off to an agent, and they'll see how the potential in it, and then we'll get to work on it together, and it will be wonderful, and then it'll sell. That's not how it works. The term slush pile is a thing for a reason. Who doesn't want to write a book? Who doesn't want to have an agent? There, you know, not just in MFA programs, but it's one of those. It's one of the big dreams, right? And for good reason. It's a wonderful thing to do. But because so many people are, and their dogs and their uncles and their cousins are interested in seeing that dream come to fruition, if you are a literary agent in this country, you are probably swamped with far more queries and potential manuscripts than you know what to do with. So agents are looking for manuscripts that make their job that much easier. And the way that you can do that, and really as an author take control of that part of the process, because let's face it, there is a lot that is out of our control as authors, as writers, even if we don't want to be traditionally published. If we're trying to find an audience, we're trying to find a readership, there's a lot that's out of our control. What is in our control is the quality of our work and making that work as strong as possible. So yes, if you are serious and you want to get an agent, you need to make sure that your work is as high quality and beautiful and perfectly edited as you can get it, whether that's with the help of beta readers, whether you hire an editor, which I've personally never done, but some people do prior to even querying agents. That's up to you. But it's very important that it is as strong as you can possibly make it, because you won't even be sending a manuscript directly to the agent first. You'll be sending a query letter. There's a whole process that goes into this. Again, we cover this in the publishing course. And if the agent is struck by your query and interested, and you're writing something that agent represents, say YA fantasy, you know, or adult, you know, or women's lit or commercial lit, whatever, they will hopefully say, hey, yeah, send me a partial. Send me, say, the first 50 pages. Your manuscript should still be done, by the way. So don't just think, oh, I'll just write the first 50 pages and deal with the rest later. No, because at that point, if an agent is interested, things move quickly. They're going to want the full manuscript. They're going to want to see, does it live up to those first 50 pages? Does it live up to the query? Is it something they're ultimately interested in? So yes, I said that was a short answer. I made it a really long answer, but the basic answer is 100% absolutely. And I would venture to say that that's one of the biggest mistakes that aspiring authors make when they set out on the road to being traditionally published, is they think it'll all just come together. I have this great concept, and nonfiction is different. I'm not going to get into that here, but nonfiction, you don't have to actually have the entire book written. But if you're writing any kind of fiction, yes, it must be completely done, even before you get an agent or any of that. So you're front loading all that work on you. I could obviously go on for a long time on this, so I'm going to move on, but it's a great question. What are some ways to publish smaller works? So I'm not sure what is meant by smaller works, if it's novellas, short story, flash fiction. Really, for all of those, especially short stories and flash fictions, this is one of the wonderful things about the internet, is there are so many outlets for publication. Now, obviously the trade-off for that great variety is sometimes you're going to be giving your work away for free. You know, it's just for exposure, or maybe you'll even make a donation to the website when they publish your story. There's so many different scenarios, but really you can go in any number of directions. You can, of course, write a short story collection and try to pitch that to agents. My understanding is that's a little bit of a tougher sell, especially for debut authors who don't already have, a backlist of books going. But there are just so many places. I suggest, most of you have probably heard of Poets and Writers, poetsandwriters.org. They have the hard copy magazine. They have a submissions calendar, a listing of places, journals looking for, I think I tend to think they tend to slant toward literary writing and poetry. But I think P&W is a great place to start. So either check their website, subscribe to their magazines, hard copy, really nice quality, and it's not that expensive. You can usually find a little discount on it too. What is the actual process of getting something published from the point of submitting a work to a publisher to seeing it in print? So again, I have to rein myself in because I could talk for hours about this. And again, we talk about this process in the course, not to keep going back to the course, but this is something we spend a few weeks, more than a few weeks. We spend the large majority of the course is sort of built around this arc. So this question says, submitting a work to the publisher to seeing it in print. Here's how I do it, and it's a fairly standard traditional path. Is I have an agent, that's its own part of the process. Once you have an agent, you write another book. So I have written books that my agent has loved and sent on and that have not sold. I have written books that my agent has not been so psyched about, but we've put out anyway. There's one actually that hasn't yet sold. It's still out there as far as I know. And I've written books that we both loved and that sold. So the roads can diverge and go off in any number of directions. The traditional arc, though, is writer writes book, makes that manuscript, again, as strong as it can be to within an inch of its life, if possible. I have an agent who tends to be quite editorial. At least she did in the earlier days. Now she's got some pretty high-profile clients and has become a little less editorial, just for time's sake. She also has 4 daughters, so I understand. Often you can work in conjunction with your agent once a manuscript is in fairly good shape to really polish it, really get it really sharp and ready. And then when the agent thinks it's ready, they will send that out to a list, a predetermined list of editors at different houses who they likely know, have likely lunched with, socialized with, etc., and who they think will be interested in this sort of thing. Again, agents and editors talk. Editors say, hey, what have you got? I'm really interested in dystopian adult sci-fi, with sort of a literary feel to it, for instance. And an agent, if they don't have, hopefully they have someone on their client roster. It's like, ooh, they just wrote something like that. And so it's a matchmaking situation at that point. So what my agent typically does, she'll know the manuscript and she will think, okay, I have a list of typically about half a dozen-ish editors, and she'll usually start at the top, the really top ones. We want to kind of go for that brass ring right off the bat. And we'll put together a packet of materials, typically a synopsis, anything that she thinks those editors will be interested in. So typically like a shorter query or like a blurb, synopsis. There can be, just depending on the editor, any number of things that make it sort of easy for them to get a real sense of the work without having to read the entire novel-length manuscript. If things go well, and I've had this go any number of ways. Editors can either take a long time, and ultimately, in one case early on, I had an editor at St. Martin's request a rewrite. She really liked it, but it wasn't quite there, so she requested a rewrite. I was super excited. I rewrote this thing, got my hopes up. It was ultimately a pass. Very common in publishing. Still heartbreaking and devastating at the moment, but it's all good. You live on. I've had another scenario where the book, this was 100 Days, my YA novel that came out in 2016, that went out to, it was about half a dozen editors, and right away, boom, we had requests, and they wanted to hold it longer, and it quickly got into a situation which is the ideal situation, and I would dearly love to repeat that someday, where it was getting into, it didn't quite go to official bidding war status, but it basically got to a point where we had interest from multiple parties without it having to go out on another round of submission. So that was lovely. In that case, the author has the choice to go, okay, who's interested in it? And you know, you can talk to these different editors, get a sense of them and their vision for the book, and kind of go from there. So that in a nutshell is the general arc. And then once a book is sold, because this question did say to seeing it in print. So once a book is sold, you go into there's the contract negotiations phase, and then there is the editing, you know, revisions and editing phase that you will do with your editor at that publishing house. And then you start working with publicists, you get cover art design, whatever. If you're writing a graphic novel, obviously that's something totally different, or a children's book. So depending on what you're writing, that process is going to go differently, but it goes. Editing, revision, copy edits, things get more and more and more and more fine-tuned until you get back what are called the galleys, which is basically how your book is going to look on the printed page. That's pretty exciting. And then once those are signed off on, and any tiny little typos, those annoying little things that still appear once it's on the bookstore shelves, which is maddening. But once you get as many of those as humanly possible at the time, it then goes off to the printers. Typically the time between sale and when it's available to the public is, you know, it can be a year and a half, 2 years. It's not a short, quick process. That's something a lot of people are surprised by too. But again, great question, and that is typically the arc. Of course, there are any number of offshoots from there, just depending on the situation. It's very individual. Describe my process when approaching, the question is, describe your process when approaching publishing. Can you make a checklist? Yes. I may sound a little defeated. At this point, I have come through the middle lands of my latest manuscript, which is another YA, and I like it, but I'm very exhausted by it. And I'm now into the revision phase, so I'm going through it and revising. You know, the first big checklist item is write a book, and depending on what you're writing, this can take years. I'm a slow writer too. I'm not fast, and I've really had to find my peace with that, especially when I have author friends who, you know, it seems like they're coming out with a book a year, and I don't understand. So write a book, write the best book you can, write the book that's in your heart, that is in your brain, that is needing to be written by you. I always, this is another conversation, but I will just quickly insert that I always caution against trying to time the market. Again, as I just mentioned with the last question, the time from sale to bookstore shelves, typically it can be up to 2 years. It can be longer, but a year is fast. So if you're trying to time the market, everyone's reading X right now, I'm going to write X. I remember trying to do this myself back in the day with chick lit, which was in the, you know, late 90s, early 2000s. That was where it was at. And trying to think, oh, I'm going to write this great, you know, chick lit novel. And by the time I was into it, it was already passé. It was so yesterday. So I caution against that. I think just write what you need to write, because also if you're writing a novel length work, that's a long slog. And if you are trying to write based on what you think is someone else's idea of what you should write, I think you're setting yourself up for a really hard time. Even when you love your concept and you love your characters and you're invested in this world, I am here to tell you there are some hard moments, there are some dark, sloggy periods in the writing of a novel, as some of you no doubt know, where you need to really be able to push through. And if you don't have that total passion for what you're writing as your foundation, for me personally, there's no way I would have been able to write the manuscripts I've written. And I've written many manuscripts that have not seen the light of day, by the way. But it's hard. It's a long, hard process. For shorter works, short stories, that's a little bit different. But yeah, so as far as a checklist, so write the best book you can write. If you don't have an agent, as you know, I recommend getting an agent. Not totally required. Of course, you might want to self-publish, in which case an agent, some self-published authors do have agents, but I would say probably the vast majority do not. And then a lot of the situation is in your control at that point. For those who do want to go the traditional route, Ideally, you'll have an agent, or you will soon get an agent. Work with that agent, send the manuscript. If it's strong, agents can pick up a new client with a strong manuscript, and that manuscript can be out on submission to editors out in the marketplace fairly quickly. If you've done your legwork and you have something that is pretty much ready to go, or just needs fairly minor quick fixes, you can get out there pretty soon. And as a debut author, you really want to leverage that, because there is a certain magic, whether real or perceived, that editors see in shiny new debut authors who have, no publication history, no poor book sales or mediocre book sales. It's sort of this fresh, shiny entity. So you want to leverage that as a debut by really making sure, again, that things are polished. And then once your agent has it out there, your work at that point, in my opinion, maybe take a small break, little vacay, or a staycay, and then work on the next thing. Really hard to do. I didn't do that when my first novel sold. I was even out on submission, and that one took a while to sell. I was so caught up mentally in that I was not doing what I should have been doing, which is working on the next thing. I learned with my second novel, once it sold, I was super excited, but I was also brainstorming on the next thing, which did not sell, by the way. I'm not trying to discourage anyone, but not everything sells once you sell a novel. You still, at the end of the day, you're still starting from scratch with each new project. So you need to, if you're going to go the route of traditional publishing, you need to be thinking long-term, as in lifetime career. Try to envision, what am I going to do in different scenarios? How have I been up to this point in my life in different professional scenarios, school scenarios? What are some things I'm going to need to work on to really see this through as a career for the rest of my life, potentially? And again, everyone's different that way, but that's kind of the checklist: is write a novel, either you get it out there or your agent gets it out there, and then you let that baby have wings, and you work on the next thing and keep it going. This is a career. It's not just about one book. For most of us, for some people, maybe they just want to write one book, and that's good. That's awesome, actually. I think that would be ideal, but for some of us, it's hard to let go. So describe I just did that one. Is it truly necessary to have an agent when trying to find a publisher? I think we've covered that. The short answer, no. The other short answer, I wouldn't advise not having an agent. Contract negotiations, the first time I went through those, or my agent went through them, and an agent will check with you to make sure you're ultimately agreeing or not agreeing to these things. They were surprisingly intense and detailed, and there was terminology I had no idea what it meant. I mean, contract negotiations alone, the legal aspects of selling a manuscript to a publisher are, that's not for the faint of heart. If you're an attorney, your day job, you probably handle that just fine. That's not the only reason to have an agent, but you'll probably do okay with that phase. You can outsource any questions that you have. But that alone, if you're really serious about this, and especially in traditional publishing, there's no way I would do it without an agent. And my agent has been more than worth her 15% cut, which is the typical standard rate that agents get from authors. I do understand that, if you're Stephen King or you're, some hugely popular author, you can start negotiating your agent's cut. I'm not there yet, but she's absolutely been worth every penny of that. I have had no regrets about that. So finally, and I'll stop here, how did you find your agent? I will be the first to tell you that I got my MA in a program here at Northern Arizona University. It's now an MFA program, but back then it was an MA. And I hit the ground running after that. But I also was a little bit clueless because we hadn't really gone into publishing. It's one of the reasons I wanted to teach this course for Lindenwood, because I remember back in the day being in grad school and wondering, what do I do? I want to do this as a career, but I have no idea of the business side of things. And so I had a lot of assumptions that weren't right, and all I had was sort of my imagination. So I started to educate myself about that, and it took several years before, from the time I started querying agents to the time I actually, when I got an offer of representation, it was from multiple agents. And I think the reason for that, I know the reason for that, was because I started off sort of flailing a little bit, not quite knowing what to do, but trying to learn as I went. And my first rejections, my first many dozen rejections, were just, little slips of paper. I'm dating myself here. It's basically pre-internet. Little slips of paper. I'd get little comments on there, so I'd get better quality rejections, which is a really good thing. Don't downplay that. For those of you who are submitting your work and starting to see that the rejections are getting a little more personalized, that's huge. Doesn't seem like it. It's still depressing because it's ultimately a no, but it's a sign that you're getting better at querying your work, and maybe the stories themselves that you're sending out are getting stronger. Okay. So I started getting more and more better rejections. I started getting a sense, some agents would be surprisingly generous with their time. They'd write a whole letter about what they liked and why it ultimately wouldn't work, and have I considered this, and might I consider that? And I just let myself, and there's a lot of angst there. It's really hard. It's very hard to face rejection when it's something that we love and we have the big dream. It stops a lot of people. I would guess that it stops the vast majority of writers from seeking publication. You have to have a certain amount of really intense tenacity deep down to put yourself out there. And now with the internet, it's even, agents are swamped even more with queries. I'm getting a little off-road here. So how did I find my agent? So kept querying. I have a real stubborn streak. I can be really very sensitive, and that whole right-brained sensitive writer thing, but at my core I can also have a real stubborn streak, which I think served me in that pursuit. I just kept querying. I wrote, I was working on manuscripts. I wrote another book, and it felt better to me. It felt stronger. It was an adult manuscript from the perspective of an adult, and I queried agents, and that started getting requests for partials. So the first 50 pages, it was like, oh my gosh, this is great. And then those would get rejected. That'd be really depressing. Send out another batch of queries, probably six at a time or so. Somewhere I have them in a box, just this massive box of my rejections. I should do that thing that authors do where they wallpaper the walls. Kept honing the query. I was using Jeff Herman's guide back in the day, which is what I incidentally still use for the publishing course. We use a lot of resources, but the text that I have used up until this point is the Jeff Herman's guide to getting published. The Writer's Market one is really great too. There's several. I just like Jeff Herman's for whatever reason. I think a lot of it's nostalgia because it worked well for me. It helped me learn. Finally heard back from Stacy Glick, and then another gal, I can't remember, her name is escaping me. She's another big gal in New York City who she was on that dream list. Actually, no, I did not hear back from Stacy Glick. I heard back from Miriam Goderich, who was an agent at the agency I have now, who basically said, I got your query. This is not something I really represent. It's not quite for me, but there's an agent that I think it is for her. So she sent it on to Stacy, who then, along with this other woman at a different agency, both contacted me roughly at around the same time, and both expressed interest. They wanted the fulls, and then both basically offered representation after that, which was hugely exciting and also really tough because all of a sudden, overnight, after years and years of this process, I had to make a choice. So I talked to each of them, and I had to just sort of use those spidey senses to think, this is a working partnership. This is not, this isn't a best friend situation. It's going to be a working partnership. But, what sort of vision do they have for not just this manuscript, but for my career? They brought up things I didn't know how to ask at the time. I would know better now what sort of questions to ask in hindsight. But at the time, I didn't know. I had never had an agent. And I just talked to Stacy, and I really felt that she had a vision for my career that I thought was just amazing and awesome, and she's been wonderful. Now that manuscript, this is just a quick twist that happened there. That was a manuscript, again, that was adult literary fiction written from the perspective of the adult. So Stacy was, again, more editorial at that time. She had few less really high profile clients, but she and I worked on that manuscript, polished it, and then it went out on submission. And what was really interesting about the feedback we got back from editors, which will typically happen the book goes out on submission and you either get, you know, interest in it or you get passes where it's a no. But editors are great at that stage. They'll typically write a letter, often, you know, 1 or 2 pages, just single space, basically saying, here's the issue I have with this, or here's what I love about it, here's what doesn't work for me, and ultimately it's a pass, I don't want to see anymore, or whatever. The feedback we kept getting from editors, and this is where the education continues, and this is why I encourage you to keep thinking long term, and I'm going to wrap this up. Editors were saying, hey, we really like this, but we really like this other voice of this teen character rather than the adult protagonist. Has Nicole ever considered writing young adult? And at the time I remember being actually mildly insulted because I considered myself a literary author, a literary writer, and that was my dream, and that was my vision. But the rest is sort of history for me because Stacy, we had a talk and she basically said, what do you think? Would you try it? And I thought, I guess. And I ended up writing what would become my first published novel, which was Brianna on the Brink, and it was written from teen girl perspective. And I did my research, and I had read some YA coming up, you know, as a young woman, but I found that it was really something I hadn't seriously considered doing, and yet that became the start of my path for my first 2 books. So I encourage you to, again, those of you who are in the submitting trenches or the querying trenches, try not to get discouraged. It's a long game. It's a really long game if you are in it seriously as a career, as part of your career, even if it's not your day job, okay? And we have conversations about that in the class too, you know, to try to have writing as your day job versus not. I do not, and I that's my preference. I don't want to put that kind of pressure on my writing. Again, that's another conversation. But that's what I would encourage all of you to do, is to not just be so focused on this rejection or this story and getting this one published that you forget to also keep your eye on the big picture, because it is a big picture, and you might learn things at any number of points along the way that never occurred to you. So keep your mind open, keep your hopes high, and keep control of the parts of the process that you have pretty much 100% control over, which is the writing. That's it. And learn, think about, and learn and study how you can learn to send that work out, send your art out into the world, and then let it go to a certain extent, and listen to the feedback and either decide what you want to do from it from there. But never lose your focus on being grounded in the writing. Okay? So I hope I've answered those questions fairly well. Again, don't hesitate to reach out, nmckinnes@lindenwood.edu with any questions. And yeah, have a great week, life, everything. All right, see you guys later.